Everything you think you know about the Vikings is wrong. The horned helmets, they never existed. The savage brutes who only cared about war, most of them were farmers. The flaming ships carrying their dead out to sea, a myth invented centuries after they were gone. For nearly 300 years, the Vikings terrorized coastlines across the known world, from Ireland to Baghdad. But the truth about who they really were, what they actually believed, and why the world feared them, is far stranger and far more fascinating than anything Hollywood ever showed you. The Viking Age lasted from roughly 793 AD to 1066 AD, about 273 years. And even the word Viking is misunderstood. It wasn't a people. It wasn't a race. It wasn't even a culture. To go Viking was an activity. It meant sailing overseas to raid. Most Norsemen never went Viking at all. They were farmers, fishermen, traders, craftsmen, ordinary people living ordinary lives in Scandinavia. But the ones who did go Viking were something else entirely. They came from what is now Norway, Denmark, and Sweden. And they didn't look the way most people imagine. No horned helmets. That image was invented by a German opera costume designer in 1876. Almost 800 years after the Viking Age had already ended. Real Viking helmets were simple, iron or leather, practical, functional, built for real combat. And according to their Anglo-Saxon neighbors, they were surprisingly clean. Vikings bathed at least once a week, which in medieval Europe was almost shocking. They groomed their hair. They used combs. In fact, archaeologists have found more Viking combs than almost any other personal item. These were not the filthy savages of Hollywood. They were something far more complex. It all began on June 8th, 793 AD. A monastery on the island of Lindisfarne, off the northeast coast of England. The monks were at prayer when ships appeared from the north. What happened next shocked the entire Christian world. The raiders killed some monks, enslaved others, and took everything of value: gold, silver, sacred relics, gone within hours. One monk wrote, "Never before has such terror appeared in Britain." The Archbishop of Canterbury called it a sign of the end of the world. But here's what most people don't understand about that raid. It wasn't random. The Vikings had been watching, planning. They knew exactly where the wealth was. They knew the monastery had no defenses. And they knew their ships could get them there and back before any army could respond. This was not blind savagery. This was strategy. And for the next 300 years, they would use that same strategy with terrifying precision against nearly every coastline in the known world. The reason they could do it comes down to one invention: the longship. Viking longships were some of the most advanced naval technology of the medieval world. Their shallow hulls allowed them to cross the open ocean and sail deep into rivers. That meant they could travel from Norway to England, then push inland and raid cities hundreds of miles from the coast. In 845 AD, Paris was raided. The Vikings sailed up the Seine River, deep into the heart of France. The King of France paid them 7,000 pounds of silver just to leave. They took the money and left. Then they came back the next year. That was the genius of the Viking strategy. They were not just raiders. They were mobile, unpredictable, able to appear almost anywhere, strike fast, and vanish before anyone could organize a defense. No kingdom in Europe had an answer for that, because no kingdom in Europe could move the way the Vikings moved. And their ships could do something even more extraordinary. They could cross the Atlantic. We know this because they did, nearly 500 years before Christopher Columbus. A Norse settlement at L'Anse aux Meadows in Newfoundland, Canada, has been definitively dated to around 1000 AD. The Vikings didn't just raid Europe. They found America. But pop culture leaves out something even more important. The Vikings were not just raiders. Wherever they went, they also traded. And often, they stayed. Dublin was founded by Vikings in 841 AD. Normandy in France was granted to the Viking leader Rollo in 911 AD, and his descendants would later conquer England. Even the word Russia may trace back to the Norse word Rus, because Viking traders helped establish the first organized state in parts of what are now Russia and Ukraine. They traded from Baghdad to Newfoundland. Arab silver coins have been found in Viking graves in Scandinavia, silk from Byzantium, spices from the Middle East. The Vikings connected trade routes across a huge portion of the known world, and by medieval standards, their society was surprisingly advanced. Viking women had more rights than most women in Europe at the time. They could own property, divorce their husbands, remarry, run businesses, and even refuse marriage. Viking law also had formal systems of justice. They held assemblies called things, gatherings where free men met to make laws and settle disputes. In an age when much of Europe was ruled by absolute monarchs, this was a primitive but real form of collective governance. The people history called barbarians were building something far more sophisticated than most ever imagined. But let's not pretend they were peaceful, because there was one group inside Viking society that was every bit as terrifying as the legends claim. The Berserkers, warriors devoted to Odin, the Norse god of war, wisdom, and death. Before battle, Berserkers entered a state of extreme psychological frenzy. They fought without armor. They seemed to feel no pain. Contemporary accounts describe them biting their shields, howling like animals, and charging into battle with terrifying force. Some stories even claim they attacked friend and foe alike. No one knows exactly what caused the Berserker state. Some historians believe it was ritual. Others think it was intense psychological conditioning. Some suggest the use of certain plants or substances. And others believe it was simply the most extreme form of dissociation under unbearable stress. Whatever it was, it worked. Enemy soldiers who had heard of berserkers sometimes broke and ran before the battle even began. And the word berserk, meaning uncontrollable rage, comes directly from them. You still use it today? Without realizing you're echoing the Vikings. The Viking Age didn't end in one dramatic final battle. It faded through transformation as Norse societies converted to Christianity, as their kingdoms became more organized, and as Europe built stronger coastal defenses. The conditions that made Viking raiding possible slowly disappeared. The last major Viking invasion of England ended at the Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066. But the final twist is almost poetic. Just 3 weeks later, William the Conqueror invaded England and changed it forever. And William's people, the Normans, were descendants of Vikings who had settled in France around 150 years earlier. In other words, the Vikings didn't disappear. They evolved. They went from raiders to traders to settlers to rulers. Their language shaped English. Their legal traditions influenced later systems of governance. Their ships proved that oceans once thought impossible could be crossed. And they did all of it in just 273 years, in a world where most people never traveled more than a few dozen miles from where they were born. So what does the real story of the Vikings actually tell us? That the most feared people in medieval Europe were never just warriors. They were explorers, traders, lawmakers, settlers. That the so-called barbarians who terrified Europe were also innovators. That the people history reduced to simple monsters were far more intelligent, adaptable, and influential than most ever realized. And maybe most importantly, The stories we tell about history often reveal more about us than about the past itself. We turned the Vikings into horned helmet brutes because that version was easier, cleaner, simpler, more dramatic. But the real Vikings were never simple. They were more dangerous, more brilliant, and far more interesting. Next week, we're going somewhere even darker. The real cause of World War I, not the version you learned in school, but the story behind the chaos, the collapse, and how one of the most advanced nations in the world was pulled into catastrophe. Subscribe so you don't miss it. And tell me in the comments, what surprised you most about the real Vikings?